Hi, guys. Thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. I'm Ted Yacucci, and I think that we have really what I consider to be one of the most important topics to explore and analyze of all the topics that are associated with the JFK assassination. And that is, who was the primary Lee Oswald imposter? There had to be one, and we're going to explore why there had to be one. We're going to look at all of the times that a Lee Oswald imposter came into play, and we're going to analyze exactly who that Lee Oswald imposter was and the importance that it played in the overall assassination, the conspiracy to assassinate President John Kennedy. Before we do that, I just want to take 1 minute because we are in the Thanksgiving season, and I want to give thanks to you guys. I don't think there's a channel on all of YouTube that has better subscribers and better folks that tune in and become part of our community through your comments. And we kind of all learn together as we explore this topic, which we all hold so dear to our hearts. And I just can't tell you how thankful I am that I'm so fortunate and honored that you guys, watch the channel and participate in the channel. And, we keep growing, and it just is, again, just a total honor for me. So thank you. Okay, so when was the very first known Lee Oswald imposter sighting? And that would have been in 1960 when the real Lee Oswald was defecting to the Soviet Union. FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover sent a memorandum to the State Department raising the possibility that an imposter might be using Oswald's credentials. Now, what does that tell us? That J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI in 1960, and remember, Lee Oswald supposedly defected. Of course, he was a fake defector, but he supposedly defected to the Soviet Union on October 15th of 1959. So within just a few months in 1960, the head of the FBI is already sending a memorandum saying that someone in the United States, some entity, is using Lee Oswald's credentials in a false manner. Okay, so what does it tell us? Well, it tells us, of course, that there was an intelligence component to not only Lee Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union, but what the plans were for Lee Oswald as early as 1960. The CIA certainly had future plans for Lee Oswald. All right, so that's just the very first sighting that we know of where an imposter is using Lee Oswald's credentials. Okay, so now the next big question, and this is really important. And the question is, why weren't there any Lee Oswald imposter sightings until after November 2nd, 1963? That is, as we got close to the assassination on November 27th, 22nd, why were there no Lee Oswald imposter sightings before November 2nd? And you know the answer. Think about it. It was because of what? Because of Chicago, right? The Chicago plot. John Kennedy was, of course, supposed to be gunned down in Chicago on November 2nd. We know that from when he landed at O'Hare Airport to attend the Army Air Force football game at Soldier Field. We know that Thomas Valley was set up to be the Lee Oswald like patsy in Chicago. We know that that plot was disrupted on a tip by an informant named Lee, who I very much believe was Lee Oswald. We know that four dark-complected shooters were found out by a lady in a rooming house with guns and maps of the motorcade route. We know that the Secret Service actually arrested two of those four and questioned them all night. Although now they say that they have no records of who they actually were, if you can believe that. And we know that John Kennedy's trip to Chicago was canceled at the very, very last minute. The press plane had already left for Chicago. That's how late it was. But because there were two shooters that were still at large at that point, the decision was made not to have Kennedy go to Chicago because the environment was just too dangerous. What do we also know about that day, November 2nd? Well, we know that that was the scheduled overthrow of the Diem brothers in South Vietnam. They were kidnapped and they were killed on November 2nd, 1963. That was the coup d'etat plan to not only kill President Kennedy in the United States, but to get rid of the Diem brothers and then to go ahead and put NASAM 273 into play so that the conspirators could have the Vietnam War. So very, very important that there were no Oswald sightings before November 2nd. Why? Because they wouldn't have needed him. Kennedy would have already been dead. Lee Oswald wouldn't have been needed. He would have just gone along his merry way and continued as the FBI informer and the intelligence asset for the Office of Naval Intelligence that we know that he was. Okay, so now we move to Dallas just before the assassination, the month before the assassination on November 22nd. And one of the first Lee Oswald imposter sightings we have come on consecutive weekends at the Sportsdrome gun range in Prairie View, Texas. Incidents occurred on the weekend of November 9th and 10th, and again on the weekend of November 17th, the Sunday before the assassination. At the Sportsdrome shooting range in Dallas on November 10th, Malcolm Price will identify Lee Harvey Oswald as the man who asked him to sight his rifle scope for him and then fired 3 consecutive bullseyes at a very difficult target with nearly no daylight left. 1 week later, on November 17th, Garland Slack finished putting up his target when a man turned his rifle on it, emptying his magazine. When Slack objected strenuously, the man who he said was Lee Harvey Oswald to the Warren Commission gave him a look that he said he would never forget. Okay, so now we have the first sightings near the time of the assassination, and it's at the Sportsdrome Shooting Center in Grand Prairie, Texas. But there's a couple of things that we really need to consider here. Number one, the sightings were on weekends, right? And it was in Grand Prairie, Texas. Who do we know that lives in Grand Prairie, Texas? Well, it's Michael Paine, right? The supposedly estranged husband of Ruth Paine. He lives in Grand Prairie, Texas. We also know that he had spent a lot of time, of course, with Lee Oswald, taking him to political meetings on the weekends in the 2 months before the assassination. There was a man cited with the Lee Oswald imposter or impersonator during one of those weekends, and that person was described as looking like Michael Paine. Okay, so that's really, really interesting. That it very well could have been those setups with the imposter certainly could have been manipulated by Michael Paine or people that were controlling Michael Paine. And then, of course, the second aspect of the Sportsdrome is the very real presence of Lee Oswald being set up as a potential assassin, right? Someone who they're going to say is an expert marksman, even though we know that he really wasn't, and someone that is out of control, at least as far as in social settings, shooting other people's targets and being belligerent, and operating outside of what we would consider a polite behavior. The next Lee Oswald impostor sighting takes place at the Lincoln Mercury dealership in downtown Dallas, where the impostor pretends to want to buy a car and takes a salesman on a very wild test drive. A young man walked into the Lincoln Mercury dealership near Dealey Plaza in Dallas. He told salesman Albert Bogard he was interested in a Mercury Comet and would pay for the car in cash in a couple of weeks. The man claiming to be Oswald then took Bogard for a wild, erratic test drive on Stemmons Freeway. Upon returning, he acted angry at Bogard and fellow salesman Eugene Wilson when told he would need credit to buy the car. He said maybe he would have to go back to Russia to buy a car. All right, this Lincoln Mercury dealership visit by the Lee Oswald imposter is incredibly, incredibly important. Number one, look when it took place. It took place actually in the afternoon, early evening of November 2nd. So that's actually the day after the same day as President Kennedy didn't go to Chicago in the morning, right? So at that point, they already knew that Chicago was off of the table as far as an assassination site. So it's interesting that it happened so quickly on that same day, later in the afternoon and early evening. Second, we have the imposter actually identifying himself as Lee Oswald, okay? Not any other kind of false name. He said his name was Lee Oswald, right? He takes this salesman Albert Bogart to on a kind of a wild ride on Stemmons Freeway. They're going between 75 and 85 miles an hour. And he's driving reckless because he wants to be remembered, right? He comes back and he makes a fuss about the funding. He might need to go back to Russia. Well, why would someone say that, right? In order to get buy a car in Russia. He's obviously it's almost a point of overkill when it comes to that imposter setting at the dealership. And maybe that was because of what happened that Saturday morning, November 2nd, when Chicago failed. Maybe they were in overdrive and beginning to panic, and they knew Dallas was going to be the last shot, really, to get President Kennedy and assassinate him there. So they were all out at that point. It wasn't just Albert Bogart that remembered the incident either. There was another guy named Frank Pizzo, and there was also a manager. So there were at least three people that had the same story. So why would the Warren Commission just kind of, disregard this the same way they did with everything else that didn't fit in the lone nut scenario? It's because they had to, obviously. This happened, and the Warren Commission couldn't explain it. Okay, let's go through another really, really important sighting, and that was on a Wednesday, November 20th, just 2 days before the assassination. Ralph Leon Yates, a refrigeration mechanic, picks up a hitchhiker in the Oak Cliff area of Dallas. He will swear later that it was Lee Oswald, looked that so much like him if it wasn't. And then he says that the hitchhiker carried a long brown paper wrapped package, which he claimed contained curtain rods. And this detail matched the package that Lee Harvey Oswald, of course, was later said to have been carried into the school depository on the morning of the assassination. During the ride, the man made unsettling comments and questions about the possibility of assassinating the president from a high-rise building with a scoped rifle, and even showed Yates a picture of a man with a gun. Now, the really important thing about this sighting is that Ralph Yates was given a lie detector test and he passed it with flying colors. So why was someone again impersonating not just impersonating Lee Oswald, but also coming up with the curtain rod story, which would be used, of course, with Buell Wesley Frazier on the morning of the assassination. And ask yourself this when it comes to curtain rods. Does Lee Oswald seem like a guy that would be worried about putting up curtain rods in his one-room apartment where he was staying, even though that apartment already had curtain rods hung? Also, another quick sighting that we'll talk about was the Dobbs House restaurant, in which a Lee Oswald imposter was seen being rude to a waitress about a week before the assassination. Interestingly, Officer J.D. Tippit was also supposedly in the Dobbs House restaurant at the time, shooting the Lee Oswald imposter a rather mean look. Okay, so now we get to the two really most important sightings of a Lee Oswald imposter, and they both happened on the day of the assassination. The first one, I'm sure most people are aware of, was the Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig sighting of a person that he says was Lee Oswald. That headed down from the Texas School Book Depository down the knoll towards a Rambler station wagon that was on Elm Street, got in the Rambler station wagon and was driven away westward. Okay, so, and again, he said, Deputy Sheriff Craig said that happened after he heard a shrill whistle. And that was shortly after the assassination. All right, so Deputy Craig, he can't stop the car. There's too much traffic. But later, when Lee Oswald is arrested and he's in Chief Jesse Curry's office, Craig is told to go up there. He goes up there. Jesse Curry says, "Is this the man you saw?" Roger Craig says, "Yeah, that's him." Lee Oswald says, "Hey, don't bring Ruth Payne's station, don't bring Ruth Payne into this because she had a similar car." All right, so the next question, and we've talked about this on the channel, that probably was asked to Lee Oswald that day, but never reported. The next obvious question would have been, Lee, did you get in that car? Was that you that came down that Deputy Sheriff Craig just saw? Are you saying that is correct? You got in that station wagon and headed off? And we would know the answer to that, right? Well, we don't, because either that question really was never asked or it wasn't reported to us. So we don't know whether Lee Oswald got in that Rambler station wagon or whether he left the school book depository, got on the Marcellus Street bus, got off the bus, got into the taxi, went to the Oak Cliff section after that. So one of those stories is correct. One of them probably isn't. And that would have been a wonderful way to really understand the whole imposter situation, right? All right. And then the next one, of course, is we know that when Officer Tippit was killed at 10th and Patton Street, as we've talked about and explored, the one of the shooter was seen. There were actually two people that was seen. He took off. Well, we think we know where he went, to the Abundant Life Temple, but then the imposter somehow ended up in the Texas theater along with Lee Oswald, right? And we know that. We know that the imposter was there. How? Because we had so many sightings, and we actually have affidavits from police officers that describe the second Lee Oswald being arrested in the balcony of the theater and brought out the side door, I'm sorry, the back door, and then placed in a police car and being driven away. And then all the reports of that just somehow disappear, right? We don't know who drove the car away. We don't know where he went. Although, again, because the Lee Oswald imposter that was arrested in the Texas theater and brought out the back door because he was seen just 4 or 5 blocks down from the theater almost immediately after. We do know that story. Well, just about 5 blocks later, that person who was arrested, who looks like a splitting image of Lee Oswald, could be his twin, according to the people who saw him arrested. Well, he shows up in a red Ford Falcon and he's speeding back and forth. And it looks kind of weird to a mechanic named T.F. White, who's working at Mac Pate's garage. And then when he sees this red Falcon pull into the El Chico restaurant parking lot, Mr. White decides to come across the street and take a look more closely. The car speeds away, but White gets the license plate and writes it down. He tells his boss, who tells a reporter named Wes Wise, who will later become the mayor of Dallas, that that license plate actually belonged to a 1957 blue Plymouth. And it was registered to a man named Carl Mathers, who works at Collins Radio. Okay, and of course, if you watch the channel, you know my contention that Collins Radio headquarters just north of Dallas was the command post set up by William K. Harvey, who had come over from his position as CIA head station chief in Rome early in November and set up the communications which were utilized in Dealey Plaza in order to facilitate the assassination of President Kennedy. Okay, so we have two really, really important imposter sightings the day of the assassination. One either getting in the Rambler or not getting in the Rambler, and the second imposter seen arrested in the balcony of the Texas Theater and taken out the back door. The last example that we'll look at of Lee Oswald imposters is the case of military career man Robert Vinson, I should say, who was the man who was on a CIA flight by accident. Um, Actually stated that the plane that he was on was diverted right after the assassination, landed in a riverbed by the Trinity River, picked up a man that looked just like Lee Oswald, took off, landed at Roswell Air Force Base in New Mexico, even though he thought it was headed home to where he was in Colorado. And then his whole story about how the CIA took kind of control of his life, where he was assigned, and what he did afterwards. So, if you don't know that story, here's just the very first 30 seconds of it or so, and you'll be able to watch it on my channel at any time. But it's a really great final example of the Lee Oswald impersonator who was in Dallas, how they got away. The subject of today's video is Sergeant Robert Vincent, who, if you don't know his story, we're going to get into it in a little bit of detail, but he is a sergeant who was in Washington, D.C. the day of the assassination. He ended up, crazy circumstances, as the only passenger on a CIA C-54 transport where he was trying to get home to Colorado Springs. Right after the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, the CIA plane was diverted to Dallas. It landed in a riverbed by the Trinity River. 2 men got on the plane, one of them being identified as a splitting image of Lee Oswald by Sergeant Vincent. And then, consequently, the almost total control that the CIA took over Sergeant Vincent's life for the next 8 or 9 years at least, until he left his military career total. Okay, so now the critical question, of course, who the heck was the Lee Oswald imposter? And there had to be one. It was critical that someone lay down this path of guilt for supposedly Lee Oswald, not just at a shooting range and being rude in restaurants and taking cars out for crazy test drives. It wasn't just that. It was to, okay. So the question now really becomes the critical question, who was this Lee Oswald imposter? And there had to be one. There was just too many incidences of someone laying out a trail of evidence to not only portray Lee Oswald as a marksman and someone who was capable of taking a shot or two at the president, but also someone who could also be considered a lone nut, someone that didn't really mind being rude or, not acting in public the way that most of us would act in public. So, who the heck was this Lee Oswald imposter? Now, once before on this channel, I mentioned to you guys that there was something that I really don't have a clue about. And this is really the answer to my question is really, I don't have a clue. All right. I think it must be someone who we really don't know, someone that hasn't really been associated with the JFK assassination per se. So, in other words, was it someone like Michael Payne? No, I don't think so. Michael Payne was seen with Lee Oswald many times. So, I don't think he would have been a good impersonator, even though they did look a little bit alike. Plus, I don't think Michael Payne was really all that great at espionage. I'm sure he was a great engineer, but Ruth Payne was the one that appeared in public and put out all of those lies about Lee Oswald for 60 some years until she just passed away, right? Was it Larry Crayford? I really don't know. I have to throw it out to you guys, our JFK community, for some ideas here. My only thought is that it must be someone that was created, some entity that was created by the CIA, with maybe makeup effects, everything else that would just make it very, very difficult to be able to tell that it wasn't Lee Oswald, especially if you were looking at his picture or seeing him on TV maybe weeks after the incident happened. Okay. It's incredibly important, I think, to the JFK assassination story. And I wish I had an answer. So I asked you guys when I told you that. I have no idea to this day why the fake Lee Oswald was transported, I think, from the Abundant Life Temple after killing Officer Tippit to the Texas Theater. We know there was a second Lee Oswald, of course, as we just said, arrested in the balcony, taken out the back door of the Texas Theater. I can never figure out why the heck they wanted to bring that second Lee Oswald to the theater, unless they were worried maybe that the real Lee Oswald wasn't going to show up. So maybe they had some contingency plans there. I don't know. You guys have had much better ideas than I have on that subject. So I'm reaching out again, asking for some help here. Okay. Who the heck was the imposter? Who the heck was the Lee Oswald imposter? Um, you know, um, and who was controlling him? I think I know the answer to that one, of course, with the CIA, um, and I've given a lot of reasons for that. But go ahead, put your answers in the comment if you wouldn't mind, and I'll pick it up the next video, no matter what the subject matter is. At the very beginning, and I'll kind of relay a lot of the comments that I got from you guys, and maybe we can try to figure out something. Anyway, thanks again for being subscribers and viewers of the channel. I really, really appreciate it. Happy Thanksgiving and Merry Christmas, Happy Holiday season to everyone. We'll see you next time.